join me in welcoming Dr. Jonathan Marks.
Hello, California, and people tuning in from far and wide. This is what I look like. This is what you're missing, and frankly, it isn't that much. You'll see me again during the questions and answers. Enjoy the show, and I'll see you in 50-odd minutes. Hi, my name is Jonathan Marks, and this is Thinking Culturally About the Science of Genetic Ancestry Tests. What we'd like to do in anthropology is to show how mundane exotic behaviors and beliefs are, and how exotic our familiar mundane beliefs and behaviors are. Science is a fun culture to work with because it's full of propositions that are somewhat counterintuitive, and yet we nevertheless accept. Genetics in particular is full of weird statements that we accept because we accept their underlying premises. For a notable example, peas reproduce like people. That's the first lecture in genetics class. Mendel studied reproduction in peas, and it's the same as in people. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever actually seen how peas reproduce, but thanks to YouTube, I was able to find a short video for you. This is how peas reproduce. And it is not at all how humans reproduce. And if you think it is, you're doing it wrong. There is a way in which it's similar to how humans reproduce, though, and that is from the perspective of cells. From that distinct perspective, we can say that the haploid pollen and ovules correspond to haploid sperm and egg, which then unite randomly to form diploid zygotes. Now, that is not a trivial statement by any means. But it's also not obvious at all if you examine the reproduction of peas and of people. It's a very unique perspective that makes them similar. And here's an anthropological homework assignment. How would you convince someone who didn't know about cells that people and peas breed the same way? You find yourself amongst some people who know a bit about breeding plants and they know about making babies. And they can't imagine that any sane person would confuse them. How would you convince them that your scientific explanation is right? I apologize for giving you a homework problem so quickly. If you take a step back from your own accepted knowledge and unthink the assumptions they're based on, they can seem exotic and indeed difficult to demonstrate. And again, classically anthropologically, they can permit you to see certain aspects of your own thought that you hadn't previously acknowledged. In fact, once you adopt the perspective of the cell, that plants and people reproduce in a similar fashion, you could reasonably argue in favor of selective human breeding like selective plant breeding. As of course many geneticists did in the 1920s. So I'm interested in the deployment of cultural meanings of genetic science over the last century, because genetics is the custodian of our authoritative scientific ideas about kinship. Kinship, I should add, was one of the very earliest research programs in anthropology. It involved the recognition that situating yourself within a social network of relatives is universally important, and is universally carried out in defiance of genetic relatedness. To take a simple example, our word cousin often doesn't translate cross-culturally, because in many societies the child of your mother's brother and the child of your mother's sister are considered quite different relatives. One might be considered an incestuous union and the other a preferred spouse, regardless of their genetic equivalence. In our society, of course, science has a significant role in conferring authority and legitimacy. And certainly the claim to establish relatedness scientifically is a powerful one, and a staple of daytime television. As a result of the Human Genome Project in the 1990s, DNA has become a powerful cultural symbol. If you're as old as I am, you may remember a time when there was no advertising about DNA. But there is now a popular colloquial usage of DNA in advertising to mean essence. the deep core of your being. Thus, adventure is in a Land Rover's DNA. But cars don't have DNA, you protest. This must be metaphorical. Like aviation in our DNA. From a scientific perspective, if there's one thing we can pretty safely say is not in human DNA, it's flying. We are pretty much built for walking and maybe a little brachiating. But aviation is no more in our DNA literally than echolocation is. And high definition is in Sony's DNA. The point is that it's a metaphor nobody was using before the Human Genome Project, because there is in fact no meaningful scientific literal sense in which multinational electronics corporations can have DNA. This is a metaphor intended to evoke some rudimentary understanding about DNA as a sort of biological soul. In addition to giving us this popular view of DNA, a different offshoot of the Human Genome Project involved turning Ancestry into a commodity. Early on, say a decade and a half ago, this began with the use of mitochondrial DNA as a genetic marker, and matching up a client against the geographical patterns of mitochondrial DNA among presumptively indigenous peoples. Such a match could divide Europeans into a handful of mitochondrial clans of the Upper Pleistocene, or connect an African American to a contemporary group of Africans, although of course these are connections that would only exist in the mind of a geneticist. Mitochondrial DNA, after all, is inherited from the mother clonally, not biparentally, like the chromosomes. So in every generation of ancestors, you match one, your mother's mother's mother's, etc. mother, and are unrelated to all the rest. Of your 8 great-grandparents, you're a clone of one and unrelated to the other 7. So if you're using mitochondrial DNA to establish ancestry, you are missing 7/8 of your ancestry. That's a lot of potentially false negatives. Moreover, there were never 7 Pleistocene clans of Europeans, mitochondrially or however. It's a fabrication, reifying the coalescence of a genetic tree into a single data point. Gathering them into 7 imaginary clans, with no rules of membership other than genetics, and mitochondrial genetics at that, essentially constructs a make-believe world like Game of Thrones, with Starks and Targaryens and Lannisters. In other words, this world of prehistoric mitochondrial clans is entirely fictive, but rendered legitimate through the application of technology. It hardly purports to present information about the real world. It simply links you up with like mitochondrial white people and makes up an origin story for you. The biological meaning of the mitochondrial DNA match depends upon the sampling of the continent for an estimate of its accuracy and uniqueness. The non-biological meaning of the mitochondrial DNA can be constructed through advertising. While mitochondrial DNA tests are still widely available, they have been largely superseded by analyses of the nuclear genome, the chromosomes. The innovation here in the first iteration, which I'll come back to later, is the development of what we can call plausibility genetics. The science of the, it might be true, and if it's not, nobody is hurt and no one will ever know anyway. Instead of directly matching your mitochondrial DNA with someone in their database, we're now going to do a fine-scale examination of the chromosomal DNA that varies from place to place. Now, this is a tiny subset of the genetic diversity in our species, and is mostly quantitative in nature. One group of people has a particular genetic variant as 40% of their gene pool, and another group has it at 70%. So, all other things being equal, if you have that bit of DNA, you're a little bit more likely to be from group 2 than from group 1. If you collect information from a lot of DNA sites, you can make a probabilistic statement about an unknown sample. Then your computer algorithm reduces the multidimensional data set down to a simple matrix of similarity to those gene pools, which is understood as genetic relatedness, or ancestry. Now, do the ancestry tests work? Spoiler alert, yes. Another spoiler alert, but only to a first approximation. And their ultimate value as a major site for the public engagement with science is an open question. In fact, it's the question I'd like to spend most of my time on today. Why do the DNA ancestry tests work? Because there is a small subset of the genetic diversity in the human gene pool that is patterned geographically. And why don't they work? Because the geographical variation in our species doesn't correspond to familiar social divisions, nations, ethnic groups, races. Any group of people you can name can have their gene pool isolated and analyzed. The French, the Hopi, Harvard alumni, Major League Baseball players, plumbers. And every group will have their own idiosyncrasies due to their history or composition. Africans are more likely to carry the sickle cell allele. Northern Europeans are more likely to carry the cystic fibrosis allele. South African Boers to carry the variegated porphyria allele. East Asians, alpha thalassemia. Pennsylvania Amish to carry the Ellis-Van Creveld syndrome allele. Ashkenazi Jews to carry the Tay-Sachs disease allele. And obviously, if you turn out to have any of these alleles, we can make a statistical guess as to where you got it from. And that is what the ancestry tests do. They mine the human gene pool for the small bit of genetic diversity that is geographically variable, assign statistical value to it, and tally up the results. Of course, that last bit requires a comprehensive database of the genetics of the indigenous peoples of the world, as well as some pretty fancy statistical analysis, but it's certainly doable. And you would expect it to sort out rather like familiar physical features. If you have straight blonde hair and a narrow nose, you probably have a lot of ancestry from Northern Europe. The idea of constructing or reifying human groups on the basis of their features is certainly not new. In the 1930s, a leading American anthropologist and public intellectual, Ernest Houghton of Harvard, casually depicted the derivation of the Eastern European Jew. It's sometimes hard to tell whether or how facetiously to take Houghton's writings, but he seems to have meant this seriously, deriving the Jewish profile from the Iranian plateau, the Alps, and the Arabs of the Mediterranean. The problem is not with the fact that you may know some Jews who kind of look like this, but rather with the Jews who don't. If you happen to look like the actor Kirk Douglas or the anthropologist Ashley Montagu, that is to say, if you deviate from the type, then you become inauthentic, which you may exploit to your advantage. But the image is a stereotype, which doesn't admit of deviations. And this problem is more subtle but also more profound in genetics, where you plan to compare individual unknowns against reference samples. Who stands for the populations in question? What samples do you want to represent patterns of human diversity? What samples do you need to represent patterns of human diversity? And what criteria do you apply to select people to represent those patterns? After all, if you're charged with assembling a representative gene pool of the Jews, do you reject Izzy Dembski and Israel Ehrenberg because their noses are too straight? And as we'll see in a bit, that is not as idle a question as it sounds. This is probably a good time to recall that we have not just started studying human diversity. We've been studying human diversity for a long time and have learned something about it. In the first place, most human variation is cultural. That's why we have genders and ethnicities, after all. Biological differences simply don't do the work in our species that they do in other species. In fact, there are far fewer genetic differences between any two people drawn from anywhere in the world than there are between two chimpanzees from Central Africa. We aren't very diverse biologically. Consequently, we pad genetic differences with symbolic differences of human invention, the products of history rather than of microevolution, like styles of dress, dialects, personal adornment, scarification patterns, and other bodily disfigurement, that is to say, with culture. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that you wanted to ignore the major pattern of human variation and focus only on genetic differences. If you just focus on genetic variation, the major pattern is that most genetic variants can be found most everywhere. Human populations are highly polymorphic, and the genetic variants are cosmopolitan. However you measure this, upwards of 90% of the detectable genetic variation in our species is patterned this way. This is from an old cartoon explaining how if you need type A blood, you can get it from someone of any complexion. Now suppose you decide to ignore that and focus on the small fraction of genetic variation that varies from place to place. What pattern would you find? Once again, this has been studied extensively, and the clearest pattern that emerges is gene pools varying gradually over geographical space. The biologist Julian Huxley gave this pattern a name in 1938, calling it clinal. And by the early 1960s, people working in human population genetics were realizing that this pattern describes human variation far more accurately than the concept of race does. And suppose you decide to ignore the major patterns of human genetic variation and the major patterns of between-group variation and just focus on the variations that seem to be restricted. What pattern do you find? You find local variation. That local variation may be small or large geographically, but it doesn't map onto continental boundaries and delimit familiar racial groups. In other words, there doesn't seem to be any obvious joints in the human gene pool that we can use to carve up the human species in some sort of rigorously natural way. The most significant discovery about the human gene pool in the last generation is that the gene pool of Africans subsumes that of Europeans and Asians, and there's only a tiny range of non-overlap. So that when geneticists in the 1960s were asking which pair of gene pools of Europeans, Asians, and Africans were most similar to one another, they didn't realize that their cultural assumption that those were equivalent groups rendered the question essentially meaningless. And that brings us to the second set of things we know, which is about the composition of human groups. For example, they are historically ephemeral. They come into existence and pass out of existence, and they do so as politically salient identities. So, for example, 3,500 years ago, the identity of Hittite was an important and fearsome one in the Near East. But it isn't anymore. The people who once had that identity are long dead, and their descendants, if they had any, are other things. There may be people in Turkey today who are descended from the Hittites, but they aren't Hittites, because Hittites is no longer a thing. We see it in the modern world with the category Hispanic, which became a politically salient category in the late 20th century, but has no entirely naturalistic meaning because it's defined on the basis of what language your ancestors spoke. Consequently, it embraces and links together people of Cuban, Mexican, Puerto Rican, Spanish, and Filipino ancestry. Human groups are biopolitical units, not biological units. Further, one's identification as a group member is a very cultural identification, because we never have just a single identity. The meaning of an identity lies in its contrast categories. Thus, in Conan O'Brien and Prince Harry, you might just see a couple of underpigmented gingers. But of course, the difference between an Irishman and an Englishman is a very meaningful one in spite of the biological similarity. Or you might contrast both of them against someone of Southern European ancestry. Or you might contrast all three against someone with African ancestry. Our identification as group members is only partly a fact of nature, but is symbolic, hierarchical, and context-dependent. And with rare exceptions, human populations are in genetic contact with one another. Humans have traded for tens of thousands of years, and where goods flow, so do genes. All societies have ways of absorbing spouses, adoptees, prisoners, or strangers, and various motivations for doing so. And finally, the units of human antagonism are not biological units. The people that hate each other the most are never the most different, but rather simply the worst neighbors. And of course, their cultural descendants may find themselves allied against a common enemy. So biological variation exists in our species and has several well-studied patterns, but is rendered meaningful in cultural and political contexts. The relevant cultural and political context for making sense of biological relatives is what we mean by the study of kinship, and involves the cultural state of what Marshall Solins calls mutuality of being, which overlaps with, but never maps perfectly onto the sharing of DNA. The most obvious reason is that kinship entails more than genetics. It entails the legality of marriage and a system of obligations and expectations towards in-laws, and affords you a shorthand that allows you to situate anyone you don't already know into a matrix of pre-existing relations. Its patterns of residence, names, legacies, and descendants of common ancestors, real or imaginary. Which brings us to the cultural aspects of this work. We've already seen the cultural power of DNA at work for Land Rover and Sony, as more or less predicted in this classic 1995 book by Nelkin and Lindy. Relatives are created by ancestors. The ancestors are consequently very important. Indeed, we can say the ancestors are always sacred. I don't mean that necessarily in the colloquial sense of holy, but in the more general anthropological sense of special. We treat the ancestors respectfully in our own ways. Sometimes we seek their guidance. If they get mad at us, they might come back to haunt us. Or if you remember the Da Vinci Code, spoiler alert, there might be someone alive today who is the lineal descendant of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Yet that would be genetically trivial. After 40 or so generations, Jesus' blood would only be there in a homeopathic dilution. The ancestors are special, and even more so symbolically than genetically. That's a relevant cultural fact. Another is that genetics carries cultural authority as science in matters of ancestry. And with authority comes responsibility, because there's also a political and moral question behind the science. So in 1845, Charles Darwin is rewriting The Voyage of the Beagle and reflecting on slavery and the brutality that he had witnessed in South America. And he throws in this line: "If the misery of our poor be caused not by the laws of nature, but by our institutions, great is our sin." And today we look at that and say, wow, that's a pretty woke thing for a wealthy Victorian gentleman to say. We might be responsible for the misery of the poor. But let's turn that statement around. Suppose the misery of the poor is indeed caused by the laws of nature. Then what? We owe them nothing? They deserve to starve? but at least we haven't sinned? Or to put it another way, forget sickle cell anemia and cystic fibrosis. The important question for society is, what is the basis of inequality? Either we have sinned against the poor, in which case some sort of atonement is presumably called for, or else we haven't sinned against the poor, in which case what? Shouldn't we still try to make their lives better regardless of our sins? Or does this reflection come with the presumption that if poverty is the result of natural, inherent, genetic qualities of the poor, then they deserve it? Well, as you can probably see, the latter position is harmonious with a radical conservative political stance, and there has always been a synergy between the science and the politics. From the beginning of the 20th century, the first English textbook of Mendelian genetics by Reginald C. Punnett of Caius College, Cambridge, concludes with this thought: permanent progress is a question of breeding rather than of pedagogics, a matter of gametes, not of training. As our knowledge of heredity clears and the mists of superstition are dispelled, there grows upon us with ever-increasing and relentless force the conviction that the creature is not made, but born. It sounds as if he's not only teaching you how genetics works, but is also trying to convince you that your lot in life is predestined by your ancestry. That is a message very similar to the one promoted at the end of the century in the bell curve. The poor are poor by nature, in this case by IQ. Therefore, they don't deserve equality or remediation. But that's not what genetics shows at all. Genetics is about how heredity works, not that your DNA is a major determinant of your life's course. That message is an infomercial for genetics, and coincidentally also a reactionary political position on the issue of social responsibility to the poor. Once again, the argument is that if the poor are poor by nature, then we have no obligations to them. Social problems not only don't work, they can't work. So no matter what you think of inequality in modern America, this ostensibly scientific statement forces you to take a political stand. That's why there is no apolitical human genetics. Because convincing the public that your DNA, your heredity, your ancestry is the major determinant of your life has a lot of intellectual consequences. It removes agency and responsibility from history and makes history a simple unfolding of preordained talents. So before we get to information about ancestry, I want to call your attention to other kinds of genetic information you receive from the testing companies. Because now that my genome is in their database to sell or use, in return I not only have a nice story about my ancestry that might be true, but I also have a lot of other information that might be true. For example, it tells me what time I should be genetically waking up, 6:51, which might be true. Now, I don't doubt that this is based on something. What I'm specifically calling attention to is the presentation, the suggestion that there is a precise, genetically set optimum time for a person to arise that is somehow independent of things like geographic latitude, occupation, or dog ownership. So now we're treating the genome like a Ouija board or a magic 8-ball, and we start finding the most amazing things from your DNA. So reading my genes here converges on reading the entrails of a chicken, as it diverges from, say, diagnosing a case of Tay-Sachs disease. Here's one other piece of my genetic information. I have 0 Neanderthal variants associated with a reduced tendency to sneeze after eating dark chocolate. Let me read that again slowly. I have 0 Neanderthal variants associated with a reduced tendency to sneeze after eating dark chocolate. Now, just for the record, the cacao plant was domesticated in Central America in the last 5,000 years. Neanderthals lived and died in Europe over 30,000 years ago. They did not encounter dark chocolate. They had very large sinuses, so they actually probably did sneeze a lot. This statement means something, but its meaning is not obvious. It takes a lot of energy from the consumer end to render this meaningful. Now, many people do get something of value from these tests, like blood relations they weren't aware of, which sometimes raises other bioethical questions. My point is that we have a delicious barbecue brisket sandwich of scientific information here. But there is definitely some baloney mixed in. It's hard to tell these components apart, and the companies don't necessarily want to help. So this is where we start to ask, given that this is science, it's carried out by scientists using biochemical and statistical technologies, what kind of science is it? What are its properties that make it different from the science, particularly the human genetics, of a generation ago? So there are two interesting novelties about the science. First, the most obvious and fundamental observation is that this is for-profit science, capitalist science, science that is marketing a product. That product is a story about your ancestry. It's a story that is based on the high-tech analysis of DNA, and it might well be true. But this is even weird as corporate science, because the science isn't in the research and development, but in the product itself. You are literally purchasing science in the genetic ancestry tests. Nobody is saying that academic science was ever pure, but at least it doesn't have to deal with the conflict of interest that this represents, maximizing profits and market share. Where science overlaps with advertising, you can expect some unusual claims. In fact, science and business have a long history. And in fact, the leading History of Science journal recently published a special issue on the subject of the entangled histories of science and capitalism. I'm also not telling you this is bad science. I'm a cultural relativist. It's a different kind of science. It's got good and bad features. On the good side, it's getting people interested in genomics, evolution, and science, who might not otherwise have been interested in those subjects. On the bad side, if the science they're getting is false or unreliable, does this serve the interests of science? My point is that we all know whose interests the corporate science will serve, those of its stockholders. The hope is that their interests and those of science will be concordant with sufficient regularity as to advance them both. Because when they don't align, you can be pretty sure whose interests will take precedence. This is simply not the kind of science that you're used to thinking about science as. And further, this is the science of the plausible. We're going to look at some data and tell you a story about it, and that story might be true. This is the science of the plausibly but not necessarily true. It's not the way we ordinarily think of scientific results. The very first generation of these tests a few years ago specified that they are for recreational use only. Now they're a bit more coy. It's for research, information, and education, says 23andMe. Or as another company clarifies, the company shall be held harmless and have no liability to customer as a result of or in connection with customer's use of or reliance on any report provided by company or any opinion given by company related to said results. We want you to buy our product, and we will say darn near anything to accomplish that end, because this is free market capitalism. But we won't stand by the scientific results legally. You had better not take your 6% Native American DNA test and try and steal a scholarship intended for real Native Americans, because we won't stand behind you. This is the science of the plausible, but not necessarily legally defensible. But the science of the plausible constitutes a revolution in the philosophy of science, because the plausible is not the traditional domain of science, but of science fiction. The domain of science is the probable. And if you can't distinguish them from one another, then what you have is not science as traditionally constituted. It's alt science. and it differs from science in having the significant property of being rejectable. Not falsifiable, mind you, but rejectable. That is to say, if you don't like your results, you don't have to believe them. The internet is full of respectable geneticists saying not to take this too literally, and full of the sources of error that may cause identical twins to have similar but somewhat divergent results. So this is unfamiliar scientific territory. It is not the perception of a problem and the collection of data to solve it. This is collecting data and then sifting through it for patterns by which to construct a story. The patterns may be real or unreal, which is why this converges on divination. Sociologists showed last year that when white nationalists don't come out as European as they'd like, they invoke the technological and statistical limitations of the genetic ancestry tests themselves to reject the results. The result may be mocking, but it's not troubling. Not to the consumers, not to the company, and not to the scientific community. This is clearly not science like climate change, vaccinations, or evolution. It's recreational science. Acceptance is optional, arbitrary, and selective. This is science with disclaimers written by lawyers. Don't take it too seriously. They are not legally responsible for the scientific results they are selling you. And this is where we need to pause and take a deep breath and appreciate that we have entered unfamiliar scientific terrain, when the scientific results come with legal disclaimers saying that you can't take them too seriously. And that is why the question, is it accurate, misses the point. It might be. We can talk sampling, or algorithms, or markers, or pedigree collapse, or standard error, and you can reject your scientific results if you don't like them. The unusual thing here is that acceptance is optional. So now we're in a position to pose the question, what does it mean to be 12% French? Or perhaps better, what could it mean? Obviously, it might mean that you had one French great-grandparent. But it might mean several other things, stemming from the fact that France is not a unit of nature, a timeless and unified gene pool. Consequently, your percentage of French must depend crucially on who the company is using to represent the gene pool of France to compare your sample to. And that, by the way, is their intellectual property. So we would naturally expect some slop in the numbers, as they misrepresent politically bounded nation states as genetic entities that you could actually have an ancestry from. Now, to get your ancestry results, they have compared your DNA to samples that they have collected worldwide and statistically estimated the similarity between your DNA and their samples. And your DNA shows a 12% match to the samples they have labeled as French. Of course, there will be some error associated with French ancestry because France is a nation and a large and diverse nation at that. And given what we know about human variation, that it varies clinally and locally, there is likely to be as much genetic difference between a northern and southern French person as there is between a German and an Italian. The key issue is, who are you counting as French to compare my DNA to? Urban Parisians? Rural farmers? Do we count immigrants? That is, are we studying the gene pool of Paris as it is today, or as we imagine it to have been a few centuries ago? And what are we looking for in their gene pools? Traces of the Gauls, or the Celts, or the Franks? And do we imagine those ancient peoples to have been somehow genetically pure? Because, of course, they weren't. So simply from the very outset of a human population genetics project, there are decisions to be made that are inescapably political. Literally, who you are choosing to include and why. That doesn't necessarily invalidate anything. It just situates this as a biocultural or a biopolitical project and the need to grapple with the cultural assumptions that go into framing it. This is biological reification. because one way or another you have crystallized the gene pool of the labeled group in your samples. You have taken a symbolic representation of the French, made it into a statistical sample of the country, and now have a unit of non-nature that you can study naturalistically. France isn't a unit of nature, but you can pretend it is and work accordingly. That's why the answer you get is accurate, about as accurate as a good look in the mirror. The scientific issue here is not accuracy, but precision. That is to say, giving you a number, often with a decimal point, but no error bar, and letting you make it meaningful. So framing the problem as your similarity to/ancestry from the gene pools of, say, France or Germany or Switzerland, even if they are geopolitical units situated in history and bounded by law, doesn't prevent you from getting an answer. The question is statistical and mathematical, and only incidentally biological, and so is the answer. Any group of people will have genetic idiosyncrasies based on how the group is composed and its history. So in theory, you could zoom in on the gene pool of the Pennsylvania Amish or the LA Lakers, analyze their distinctions, and test to see how like the Amish or the Lakers you are. But the feature that they choose to structure their comparisons quite reasonably on is geopolitical. Northwest Europe, Greece, the Balkans, British Isles. They are all places of one sort or another. 23andMe sorts you into over 150 categories, all geographical. With one exception, the Jews. The only people in this science who have no place and who come from nowhere. One could almost think that this analysis scientifically shows the Jews to be some sort of eternal wanderers, landless and unrooted by nature. What 23andMe is finding is that certain specific genetic markers are found at higher frequencies in this gene pool, which of course we know, and then which and how many of them you have. This genetic reification decouples the Jews from the geographic criteria that circumscribe all the other peoples and ancestries in their catalog, and shows again what a cultural process this is, Jewish ancestry being a non-trivial part of their client base. Indeed, Jewish ancestry pops up again in an unexpected way. 23andMe now tests for BRCA1, the major breast cancer gene, and the closely allied BRCA2. But they only test for the 3 major mutant alleles of the Ashkenazi Jews. It may be a convenient bit of information if you're Jewish, but if you're not Jewish, then it may be telling you you're clean when you are in fact not clean because you have one of the alleles that Ashkenazi Jews don't have. That's a false negative. That information is actually worse than no information at all, and they're upfront about it. The test does not include the majority of BRCA1 and BRCA2 variants found in people of other ethnicities. Therefore, variants not detected result is less informative for people with no Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. That's why it's a good thing these tests are not to be taken too seriously. Since the ancestry tests are fundamentally inductive, collecting and analyzing individual bits of data, pretty much the only way you have of knowing whether the bits of data are being collected and analyzed properly, or at least reasonably, would be to do controls. Maybe run the same sample multiple times, give the sample to multiple companies, and compare the results. Journalists recognized this as a fun story a few years ago and started performing these experiments. And sometimes, results like this writer for the Washington Post, who knew her father's family was Italian and her mother's family was Dutch, and took her saliva to 2 different companies that promised to break down your European ancestry. where one company had her at 45% Northwest European, the other had her at 32%. Where one had her at 29% Southern European, the other had her at 55%. And both gave her a bit of Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry that she had never heard of, perhaps one great-great-grandparent. In another widely publicized example, 3 identical triplets were given a genomic ancestry test for a television show. The test showed that they had a very predominantly Northern European ancestry, although you hardly needed a genetic test to determine that. More significantly, as the categories became more finely detailed, they also became more discordant, even though these 3 women are genetic clones. So their French and German ancestry, and again that's what the company was specifying, ranged from 11 to 22%. To understand this as science, we would ideally like to see error bars around such statements to tell us that in this science, 11% and 22% are effectively the same number. Just last year, a Canadian journalist and her identical twin sister, both rather Mediterranean-looking, took DNA ancestry tests from 5 companies, yielding 2 sets of comparisons, twin to twin and company to company. And obviously the twins generally match, but once again, the finer the purported discrimination, the larger the disparity. And across companies, their Italianness ranged from 3 to 37%, and their Balkan and Greekness ranged from 23 to 80%. The results accord with what you would get by eyeballing them and knowing something about what the peoples of Europe look like. So it does work, yes, to a first approximation, like a look in a very expensive mirror. But from the standpoint of understanding this as a science, if 23 and 80 are the same number, then this science is using numbers differently than most science does. A recent study found strong concordance for twin results when done by the same company, but broad differences when done by different companies. Why are there these discordances and this large numerical uncertainty? In the first place, different companies have different reference samples. In the second place, different companies tally different regions of variability in the genome. You have to look very carefully in the genome to find places where humans indeed do differ from one another. Our DNA is 98% identical to a chimpanzee's DNA, after all. And when you do find regions that differ from population to population, these are almost invariably quantitative differences, not qualitative ones. So you have to establish arbitrary thresholds for including these DNA sites. Then you need an algorithm to reduce the complex multidimensional matrix of similarities between the unknown sample and the reference samples into a scalar measurement percentage. What could possibly be tricky about that, he said, with IQ in mind. And then you need to transform your inference of similarity to the reference populations into a discourse of ancestry. Not only are there different ways of accomplishing these operations, except perhaps for the last one where you just sort of wave your hand and say it's now ancestry, but it's also difficult to know which of 2 companies is giving you more reliable numbers, because the relevant information is their intellectual property. It's a problem if you misunderstand what it is you're buying. You're buying a story. They even tell you that. You're purchasing the story of your ancestry, and like all stories of ancestry, it contains mythic elements. This is sacred narrative territory and legal territory. After all, there are no official rules governing quality control on non-medical genetic testing. In a regular science lab, if you don't do the work well, you get fired by the postdoc or principal investigator. If you're the principal investigator and your work isn't very good, you don't get your next grant. If you're marketing a diagnostic medical test, you have to prove to the FDA that it works. But in this science, the data production and analysis are largely black boxed, and the product is a story. So you could, in theory, claim to do a genetic test for pretty much anything, and do it without much fear because this is a science in which true and false don't really matter so much anymore. Or at least no more than they matter in analyzing the position of the planets on the day you were born. In genetic ancestry testing, truth and falsity are dictated by customer satisfaction, and the public understanding of science is driven by market forces. That's pretty unusual. Which is why Vinome.com could sell you wines based on their analysis of your genome. Who's to say that their story is wrong? Alas, that genetic service is no longer with us as of earlier this year. Perhaps there is hope after all. A local news station in Chicago sent a bunch of samples out to different genetic testing companies to compare the results. Only one of the companies failed to tell that the DNA they were analyzing was from a dog. And they're still in business, and specializing now in genetic tests of behavior. And they also have a very comprehensive disclaimer in the terms of service, which I won't bore you with. You can imagine what it says. So to summarize, there's a lot more here than just DNA. There's our basic understanding of what science is, how it works, and what it means in modern life. This is the science that might be true, that nobody gets hurt if it's wrong, and some people are making a lot of money from. I'm not against people making a disreputable buck. That's pretty much the American dream in a nutshell. But I think this ultimately erodes confidence in science. And although I'm as much of a relativist as the next fellow, I think it's a good idea to have as much confidence as possible in science. I don't see this project, selling glimpses of ancestry with unclear accuracy and unreasonably high precision, as working towards that end. This is the trade-off of science popularization. You glorify archaeology in a movie, but leave viewers uncertain of the distinction between archaeology and looting antiquities. That in turn creates a challenge for the field. Is the rise in public interest worth the cost of public misinformation, especially given the nature of our jobs, which often involve education? For example, is the interest in prehistory generated by the paleo diet worth the cost of actually knowing that nothing like these foods was available in the Paleolithic? And anyone who thinks this is in any scientific sense a Paleolithic diet is comparable to the creationist who doesn't believe there was a Paleolithic at all because Adam and Eve were tending a garden from the very beginning. So on the one hand, we have the fact that DNA ancestry testing is generating public interest in DNA and genomics, and the merits of stimulating the economy. The eventual effects of privatization upon the science of genetics are unknown, but may well parallel the costs and benefits associated with privatized healthcare. And certainly there is the possibility of medical advancement by the companies who own the information. And on the other, the fact that selling science that you can't stand behind because it may be false or unreliable helps to erode the authority of science more efficiently than any creationist, ancient astronaut enthusiast, or flat earther could ever hope to accomplish. In this context, is the production of interest in genetics and kinship worth the reification and naturalization of constructed human categories? Or put differently, what are the costs associated with reimagining racial, ethnic, and national categories as facts of nature rather than as facts of culture with some trivial biological correlates? I should add that anthropologists are generally better at posing questions than at answering them. But what ties all this together is the complex relationship between the scientific knowledge and the understanding of human diversity and the informal ideas, the folk ideologies we bring to the understanding of human diversity. I've tried to introduce you to some of the issues associated with genetic ancestry testing. I certainly hope that I have not left you with the idea that I consider them valueless. Actually, different communities of consumers find different value in their results. The primary question involves the connection between the consumer's expectation and the product itself, and of course, the nature of science in the modern age and its meaning to the public.